Today we're going to go through the process of upgrading my Sunlu S8 to make it a more reliable printer. We have Mike King's direct drive and Uni-T Shroud, a 3D Touch auto leveler, BMG clone dual drive extruder, pancake extruder, and additional wires for the direct drive mod. I forgot to picture Mike King's bed spacers, but those as well. Links for all products and print files will be in the description below as well. To start with, we need to remove the existing fan shroud by removing these two screws. I believe they're 2.5mm hex, but the Allen keys that come with the printer aren't labeled. I recently picked up the Sunlu S8 while it was on sale. This is a wonderful little, well, actually not little 3D printer, and is the reason I wanted it. It boasts an impressive 310 by 310 by 400mm print volume for a steal of a price. Picked mine up for $150 actually, and am now spending the money I saved from buying a CR10, which is the same print volume, to make this a more reliable and better printer. Once the shroud is removed, we need to remove the two existing fans. There are 4 screws holding the front fan on. Simply unscrew those, remove the LED holder, then work on removing the fan. Probably would be easier to get out with a small screwdriver to pry it out, but fingers work just as well. And when it comes to removing the LED, it just pushes into that little metal piece, just pull that out. For the part cooling fan, you'll need a Phillips head screwdriver. I used a P2 head to remove these, but they're actually an odd size, a PZ1, which has a slightly flatter tip, so if you're using a regular screwdriver like I am, just be careful not to strip them. Once all 3 are removed, the fan just pops out. Remove the 1 screw that's left in it and set the shroud off to the side. Next, we need to remove the hot end, which is held on with just 2 Allen key screws. You may want to remove your PTFE tube before fully unscrewing the hot end, as it makes it a little easier to do so. You do this by removing the retaining clip, pushing down on the black top piece, yours may be a different color, I've seen some in blue, and then pulling the tubing out. With the hot end removed and the fans removed, set them off to the side. It's time to remove the original garbage extruder. It is held on with 4 screws, 3 that are visible, and 1 underneath the corner that the spring is in. Be careful removing the bottom left screw that the spring is leveraged with, as the spring can shoot across the room if you're not careful, or the tension can actually break the screw or strip the ends of the threads of the hole as it comes out. The reason I say this extruder is garbage is because it's typically your first point of failure on these printers. Both this one and the original Creality ones for the Ender series are the same. They're cheap, the arms are plastic, and they tend to lose the ability to provide proper tension on your filament, causing under extrusion. If I wasn't going with the BMG clone dual gear extruder, I'd buy the cheap all metal extruders for $15 and toss that on real quick. Once all 4 screws are removed, set the extruder to the side and work to remove the motor. Typically, these just fall out once you remove the screws, hence why you see me supporting it. This one, however, was really stuck in there and hard to remove. Once it's removed, peel away the hot glue if yours still has it on there, and unplug the connector. Go ahead and pull your PTFE tube out of the zip ties and put that off to the side, as well as with the motor. The next part of our mod list is to install Mike King's direct drive designed for the BMG clone that we're going to be using. This part is 3D printed, so if this is your only printer, print what you need first before disassembly, obviously. The direct drive adapter replaces the metal spacers on your gantry. To remove the rollers, you'll need to hold your wrench, or ideally a socket, on the nut while unscrewing the screw. Be careful as you remove the second roller, as you don't want the carriage to flop down and potentially damage the belt. Once they're both removed, it's time to add the direct drive adapter. I had to remove a piece of support that I hadn't noticed, so if you have fitment issues like I did, double check that. As the adapter says, use 2 washers here in between the adapter and the rollers. You can use steel washers, which is ideal, or you can use the 3D printed ones. I used the steel ones that were from the old extruder. If you don't use washers, the rollers won't roll and will cause a binding issue. You'll want to get both rollers on before screwing them in, as it's more difficult to put one on at a time since the gantry will be in place after it's tightened up. I gave up on using the provided Allen keys that came with my printers, as you can see here, and grabbed one of my mini driver kits to make life just a little bit easier. Once the adapter is on, double check to see if the gantry is tight or if it wobbles. Mine was wobbly now, so I had to adjust the eccentric nut that's underneath and connected to the third roller. Adjust it until your gantry no longer wobbles back and forth, making sure not to over tighten it. Once it's tight, roll the gantry back and forth to make sure it's not binding. If you over tighten the nut, it won't smoothly roll. And with that done, it's time to move on to the new motor and the BMG clone dual drive extruder. One of the more important upgrades when going direct drive is to reduce as much weight as possible from your gantry so it doesn't stress the machine as much and allows for faster printing. Here we see we're swapping from the stock 9.8 ounce motor to a pancake motor weighing in at only 4.5 ounces. Next, we need to get the motor ready for the BMG clone dual drive extruder. Remove the factory gear by loosening the 2 screws on the motor, and then swap it out with the replacement one, making sure the set screw is going upward. You may have to adjust how far down the gear goes so it pairs up properly with the extruder. Go ahead and place the motor into the direct drive mount, then slide the extruder over the gear. Make sure the PTFE tube connector is facing the top of the printer. As for the motor connector, it can be facing either the top or the bottom. I eventually swap mine to the bottom, it just depends on how you want to route your cables. After that, go ahead and connect the 3 screws through the extruder and into the motor. Do not over tighten these screws, as it can crack the casing. A quarter turn past hand tight should be more than sufficient. Next, we need to install the filament tensioner, or at least that's what I think it's called. That's what it does at least. It applies tension to the gear that feeds the filament through. Anyway, slide the spring over the threaded rod, then put the washer at the end. Make sure to push in straight toward the nut inside of the extruder, as it can easily strip out or cross thread due to having to apply a good amount of pressure to get it to actually screw in with that spring. Once that's done, we can start to reinstall the hot end and the shroud. If you're installing the Uni-T Shroud, you won't actually connect the hot end at this time, but it would still be a good time to get your PTFE tube cut to the proper length, so it bottoms out against the nozzle and the feeding port on the extruder. In my case, it required 49.25mm of tubing for this. I'd recommend starting with at least 50mm and then adjusting as needed. Now onto the Uni-T Shroud. The base and the ducting connect via 3 M3x6mm screws. Make sure not to over tighten the screws, as you can easily strip the plastic. If you're concerned about them coming out, just add a drop of super glue into the hole. If you're choosing to reuse the LED, go ahead and connect the LED holder to one of the fan holes on the side. Since I'm using the stock fans, I put it into the 5015 fan size hole. Leave the screw a bit loose for now so you can adjust the aim of your LED once everything is installed. On the opposite side, we have the connector for the bed leveler. It's held on with the same type of screws we've been using, just two M3 by 6mm screws. For installing the shroud onto the printer and over the hot end, we need two M3 by 20mm screws and two washers. These screws go in through the front of the shroud and slot into their two respective holes. Once these screws are through, slide your two washers over the screws, then slide the assembly over your hot end and begin tightening things up. You can see why you'd want to make sure everything fits before installing the shroud here. Once it's connected and tightened up, go ahead and begin attaching your fans. You can use the stock screws that you took off earlier, or use some M3 by 12mm or 15mm screws to attach them with. I don't recommend adding any super glue to these screws, as the fans are a wear item and you don't want to make it more difficult to remove them in the future. The LED just presses in and can be moved to wherever you want it to point at. As for routing the cables, there is a small slot underneath the ducting for having the cables right along the side of the duct. You may have to pull some extra cable through your wire loom to get it to be long enough. For the part cooling fan, find the holes that match the size you have, which in my case, with it being the stock fan, is the 4010 holes. If you're reusing the Phillips head screws that this fan had before, you'll likely want to pre-screw the hole or drill the holes slightly in both the fan and the Uni-T Shroud. Alternatively, some M3 by 12mm screws would be better. Make sure when installing the parts cooling fan that you have the exhaust port facing down into the ducting. The last thing we need to attach is the bed leveler. I used the 6mm spacer and some M3 by 15mm screws to attach it in. Doing this mostly blind with a camera in the way makes it far more difficult than it should have been to get that back screw to line up. With the hot end and extruder all set up, it's time to connect everything to the main board. Start off by plugging the 2-meter 5-pin connector cable we bought into your extruder motor and drape that off to the left side for now. Move on to the front of the printer, remove your SD card if you have one installed, and remove the 3 screws on the front. Before trying to fully remove the front, make sure to disconnect the LCD ribbon cable from the top of the cover. With the cover fully removed, we want to disconnect the extruder cable, which is at the top right and is black. There should be an E marked to the bottom left of the connector. With that removed, it's time to feed the new extruder cable through the hole on the left side of the printer and then bring it around to the extruder connector and plug it in. Next is the bed leveler. For the 3D touch that we have, it has 2 connectors, a yellow, red, and green that plugs into the D11 slot near the bottom middle of the board, with the yellow on the left side. We also need to unplug the green Z- connector, as the black and white connector will go into this slot. The connector is supposed to go in with the black cable on the left and the white cable on the right. However, mine ended up being reversed, but it did not record me swapping it over. You'll know it's reversed if you go to home your printer and the nozzle just crashes into the bed and doesn't stop. So make sure you have your hand by the power switch if yours ends up being reversed too. Now, one thing I didn't record was extending the cable for the bed leveler. It does require a 2-meter cable as well, which is not sold online. I made mine by splicing an Ethernet wire to extend it, but hindsight tells me I should have just used one of the extra 5-pin ribbon cables and cut it up to splice on instead. There are some people in the Sunlu S8 community on Facebook that can make them for you if you're not comfortable doing it yourself, or if there's enough demand, I will start to make them and sell them as well, as finding the proper connectors online is a bit of a pain to say the least. The last thing we're doing before flashing the new firmware and testing the printer out is installing bed spacers. For whatever reason, the S8 tends to begin getting level when the springs are almost all the way out and cause the bed to not have any tension on it and gets out of level rapidly due to this. This is very straightforward, albeit more difficult than I expected. Just remove the 4 adjustment screws, put the springs on, then the bed spacer, and then tighten everything back up. I went for about 5 rotations on before I leveled the bed later. Alright, before we begin, we need to go ahead and install the updated drivers and firmware, so that way we can have the mods that we did work with the printer, such as the automatic bed leveler, and in this case also the direct drive. So go ahead and download the files. The first one's the CH340 drivers. This file type might be dangerous, we want to download anyway. See it downloading. And while that's going on, go back to driver/flashing tool and download Xloader. So there's a few files in here. We want to download the whole folder. So go back, right click on Xloader, and then click on download. So that one will zip itself and then download. So let's go ahead and run ch341 ser.exe. This is actually the drivers for the cable that we plug into the printer. Okay, so it's going to ask what type of device. That is correct. We click install, and it failed. Let me plug in the printer, 1 second. All right, then we click install. And we wait. And the driver successfully installed. So we can go ahead and close that. And now we want to open our Xloader folder. So since it downloaded as a zip file, we need to right click on it and then click extract all. And we can just extract it to the same folder it's in. And then when we open that folder, which has a weird name, it should have Xloader inside of it. And then we want to click on Xloader again. Alright, so now we have Xloader open and installed. So now we need to go back to the folder here. Alright, and then we need to go to the firmware folder, and we will take version 12, the newest version, which by the time you see this, it may be a new version, so just follow the version number that you have. And I never changed my board, so it's the OEM 18 Mega 2560 motherboard. We double click on that, and then we click on stock board with King mods. And we want the 3D/BLTouch King direct drive folder. Inside of here is one file, firmware.hex. So let's go ahead and click on that, right click on it, and click download. Now we can come back to Xloader, click on the 3 dots, and then we need to grab firmware.hex. Device, we want to make sure it's a Mega 2560, and then COM port should be the only one, COM3 in this case, it may be different for yours, and the baud rate 115,200, 115,200. And then when we click upload, this should cause the printer to actually reset a few times as it updates. So I'm going to click on upload. Well, okay, I just tapped on accident. and this usually takes a few moments. There it goes. So now we can see that it's resetting. It shows the proper firmware, and now it's ready. Now, one thing that you will have to do after you have everything uploaded is to rehome your bed and make sure that all of your adjustments are correct. I'm not going to go through that on here, but the main thing is once you do have your bed leveled, you want to come over to configuration. Personally, I disabled the run out sensor since I did not relocate it. And then we need to go to the probe Z offset to make sure it's set to what we need. In my case, it's 3.1. And if you move this left or right, the nozzle will actually move by that tiny amount so that way you can get it perfect. But once that's done, go ahead and slice the file and start your printing. Alright, so the last thing that we have to do before we can actually start to print is to modify the starting and ending G-code. So what we do is we go to our printer here and then click on Manage Printers. And then make sure you have the proper one selected and click on Machine Settings. Now in here you'll have a bit of G-code for what you have to have done. And we've got the information right here, which I will post in the description of the video. So you'll put the starting G-code here in Start G-code and the ending G-code here in End G-code. Now if you end up having an issue where your nozzle does not home after you tell it to auto home, like it's off center, you will adjust that here in the X and Y offset, but that's not something that's guaranteed that you'll have to do. And now with all of our upgrades done, our firmware flashed, it's time to do our test print. I apologize about it being kind of choppy and all over the place here. I don't have my actual camera set up for time lapses. Anyway, so we printed our benchy, came out absolutely perfect, which is wonderful. If you do have any questions, make sure to ask down in the comment section below. And as always, if you like the content I'm putting out, make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all new content as it comes out. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.